There's a few people coming in, so I'll give everyone a minute. But thank you for the introduction. Thanks for coming and spending some time with me. I know there's a lot of good stuff on today. So as you sort of wander in, thank you for coming to this talk, which isn't about alcoholism, I promise you. It's a kind of misleading title. I actually got invited to give a presentation at an AWS meetup in Hawaii, of all places, and you're never going to say no to that. The Hawaii meetup was specifically about the 10-year anniversary of Lambda. And I'm kind of quite the contrarian, so I didn't want to just have a talk about the good things about Lambda to a bunch of people already that love Lambda, love functions, love serverless. So I thought, what can I do? Maybe a bit like edgy. And Amazon really presented me with a gift, actually. I got hit a week before the talk with this quote, which was a blog post that the Prime Video engineering team put out, scaling up the Prime Video service, reducing cost by 90%. It's kind of like what you hear when you think of serverless, right? You think, oh, put in Lambda, pay for what you use, it's a lot cheaper. Turns out they actually went back to monoliths, which in my circle kind of blew up, and this was sort of all over Twitter, and everyone's going like, what were they thinking? This is Amazon, right? Like the leaders of microservices, they built functions as a service effectively. Like, why would they go back to monoliths? So today I just want to take you on a bit of a journey around the evolution of cloud architecture and kind of why it isn't a straight linear path, and it's more of a pendulum swing back and forth between some things that are fads, Web3, some things that might be a bit more long-lasting. So I started engineering back when this is what code used to look like. We used to kind of strap these things to our back, go down to a basement server room somewhere and try to deploy everything as one atomic unit. Early 2000s, right? Most web applications, it was a single code base deployed as a single unit. LinkedIn serves as a really good example of this. This is, and I joke not, their architecture diagram from 2003. This is what all architecture looked like back then. It was an app and a database. They called it Leo, and just to aid my copy paste in the rest of this presentation, I've kind of rebranded it to our friend Leo. But really all Leo was LinkedIn's web servlet, business logic, database, standard kind of 3-tier app packaged up. LinkedIn, obviously, early days wasn't super popular, started to get a bit more popular. So what do? Same thing everyone else does, just deploy another instance. They probably put Nginx server in front of everything, just to load balance everything. They started getting more and more traffic, right, which is a good problem to have, but it meant that they had to hire. As they hired, LinkedIn themselves got bigger, hence the growth. And as they scaled their internal engineering orgs, they found it's really hard to coordinate this, right? Deployments become really risky, really painful. Single bugs could take down the entire stack, and it often did, actually. So, if you were trying to stalk someone's LinkedIn and the page wouldn't refresh for a while, it was due to this mainly. Their internal mantra, I think this is hilarious, because I think they got it from Titanic, was to kill Leo. So they wanted to say goodbye to Leo, so he didn't have time to fit on the blank. I think he could have made it, but they got rid of him finally. Turns out, though, this wasn't just LinkedIn's problem. There are several other organizations going through the same sort of learnings. One of them, notably, is where I used to work, and that might be why you recognize me. A lot of you in the room kind of work with. I used to be at Amazon. But in '98, when I was just a wee lad, not thinking about distributed computing, they wrote the distributed computing, they call it the Manifesto of Distributed Computing. It's a really, really good read. I actually recommend everyone to have a read of it, because it's nearly 30 years old, but it really still does apply. And they obviously had a pretty good job of decomposing a massive monolith into web services, which they're pretty known for. But the limitations of their monolith became pretty clear due to a few reasons. I think the first was really high-risk deployments. Amazon.com, 98 wasn't the behemoth it is now, but still taking down a consumer-facing web app for a few days at a time, which did happen apparently, is not good. Poor isolation between components is another kind of tried and true story. Everyone's sort of seen that before. And difficulty scaling specific functions. It's really obvious in Amazon's case. You're probably going to fetch items more than you're going to process the cart, things like those. So why would you want to scale everything up at once when key services really make sense to scale? Limited team autonomy, that was another thing. Amazon's super famous for their 2-pizza teams, where if you want to have everyone follow that team structure where it's quite lean and quite small, but the app's growing and the space is growing, you need to be able to distribute pieces across that. So what did that lead us to? It kind of led us to getting our house in order, as I like to think. It was kind of the first swing of the pendulum towards service-oriented architecture. Companies sort of began to break down their services from monoliths into just separate services to start. And LinkedIn was another good example of doing this. They actually split Leo into separate functional services. The first was profile, then they had search, then they had search, communications, and then groups. For pretty obvious LinkedIn functions, that all makes sense. They kept going though, and eventually had 150 of these services that were all, loosely sort of defined, but had teams looking after them. So, a bit of growth by 2010. Amazon famously did the same, turning their monolith, Amazon.com that is, into dozens and eventually hundreds of independent services, many of which I'm sure people have interacted with today. This allowed their teams to deploy independently, scale, same old story. But I guess the evolution didn't stop at just services. We went a little bit further into microservices, where this was like the perceived utopia, right? Around 2013, this was blowing up. I think every tech conference on earth was talking about microservices. I certainly was. I was waking up and going, oh wow, we can make everything even smaller. This is great. So breaking it down into further, more focused components. The timing actually was perfect, right? In 2013, we had Docker released to the world, which brought containers into the mainstream. Kubernetes was there in 2014 to kind of orchestrate those containers, and then little known to many, but AWS was about to release Lambda. So in 2014, Lambda was released, and it was kind of a radical shift. If you were a dev in that space, the idea of having just functions without the compute constraints, the servers, the OS patching, all of the things we used to have to worry about, networking, scale, etc. Just give your code to Amazon, let them run it for you. It sounded like magic. And I certainly thought it was to start with, but I kind of famously went fully down this rabbit hole of Lambda for everything. It should be the default, like this is the architecture of the future. A lot of that actually was, Alice gave a talk in the other room just before about don't read blog posts. I read a lot of Netflix blog posts that had really good engineering articles around their new sort of microservice functions and what the benefits were. And they kind of became the poster child. Again, when I worked at Amazon, a lot of the customers would come to us, and these are probably some of you in the room, and they'd have a reference architecture from Netflix, and they're a small engineering team in Perth, and they'd say, hey Jesse, we want to build this responsive web service. I'm like, you and the 4 people that are in, you want to build what Netflix? Okay, that's sure, it's certainly inspiring, but maybe we don't start there. By 2016, the pendulum had swung fully, it felt like. Every single tech conference was talking about microservices. Interests, this is just the Google interest sheet, took up pretty much all of the search function for any kind of software architecture. Funnily enough, the first Latency conference, I think, I looked at the website, so that was my homework, was in 2017. And there was 4 talks about microservices, which doesn't sound like too much, but that was half of the content. It was all anyone was talking about back then. So yeah, it definitely felt like we'd reached architectural nirvana. But then I think reality started to set in as we started to operate these. It turns out distributed systems are pretty hard. A lot of them ended up catching on fire, as this does. When a bug appears in a system with hundreds or thousands of lambdas, sort of how do you maintain the state? How do you debug that? How do you have the events come through and trigger each other? How do you develop that in dev on your laptop, for example? When the functions fail, how do you reproduce the exact conditions? What about consistency, right? There's a whole bunch of problems that you run into in this space. Uber's a really famous example of this. They grew to 2,200 microservices. They experienced a lot of those issues and reported having to go through 50 services across 12 teams to diagnose one problem. When I gave this talk originally, there was an Uber engineer in the crowd who came to me later and said, dude, have a look at this spreadsheet. And he pulled it up, and it had 2,200 individual services in a spreadsheet with a single-threaded owner, so they had ownership, and then just a text description of what it was. And you'd have to, this is before you could ask an LLM, you'd have to go through and Control F, find exactly what service, what data you wanted, go and approach the team, ask or beg, really, can I have some data out of this service, or do whatever you wanted to do. But it was just a nightmare, apparently. They famously have a quote from their engineering blog, which is a really good read. While only a few years ago, many people readily adopted microservice architectures due to the numerous benefits they provide. In recent years, however, people have begun to decry microservices for their tendency to greatly increase complexity, sometimes making even trivial features difficult to build. And this whole kind of pendulum swinging too far is the theme that led to one of my favorite kind of meme videos, which is, if you haven't seen, this is the perfect example, right? You want to get a birthday, you can't. This is why. So I'll save that for some homework if you haven't seen this. Just Google microservice meme video, that'll come up, it's elite. But certainly the pendulum had probably swung too far by that point. How do we find balance in this world, right? Microservices are clearly a good idea, but taking anything to the extreme is pretty intense. the present day, we're certainly seeing it come back. I think a lot of the people I talk to now are starting on monolithic architectures or are acknowledging that they should probably think about the structure before they deploy it. But a lot of good work has been published by some of those larger orgs. LinkedIn, again, they realized this problem pretty early and coined their, I guess, platform architecture called superblocks. These are groupings of backend services with a single access API. So kind of monolithic in deployment, but with a single access API that you could work with teams. Uber developed what they call DOMA, which is domain-oriented microservice architecture. I think the really impressive thing with Uber's architecture is that 2,200 services I mentioned before, that's now just 70, right? Which is like still a decently sized spreadsheet, but it's easier to find things, easy to find teams, and easy to just semantically reason, which is half the battle. Oh, I skipped too far ahead. Amazon famously, with the Prime Video team, not Amazon.com, they went back to the monolith. Their scale limitations hit at 5% of expected load. So they were running out of Lambda. Again, this is Amazon. They were running out of Lambda consumption at 5% expected load. So massive, massive change. Consolidating for Amazon, they had that 90% sort of frontline reduction in cost. But I think the results across all of them are pretty remarkable when you think about it. Platforms of cost, support costs dropped by an order of magnitude. Time to integrate new features went down from days to hours, really important. Onboarding time for new features decreased by up to 50%. I'm going to give you a shameless plug, but if these are things you care about in an engineering org, one of the gold sponsors is an app called Wayfinder, and they do like DORA metrics and stuff. So if you care about sort of velocity and how much things cost, definitely go and have a chat to them outside. But this is like billion-dollar companies, right? Dropping something by an order of magnitude is teams worth of like you can hire a new team to build features. Increasing like velocity that's business value. So these things are super important. Having said that, Lambda still definitely excels for certain event-driven workloads, right? Like there's not a utopia architecture. Just pick the right thing for the right job. And my horrible copy paste that no one can read just shows, I'm talking about 2 today, but there's hundreds of different ways to deploy. So yeah, Lambda still for event-driven workloads. Microservices make sense at boundaries where scaling needs differ. So again, like that cart example where you have more times you're querying a certain service, you probably want to scale it in isolation. And well-designed monoliths is certainly the best place to start off. So don't read the blog and come in guns heavy. Start with something that's easy to maintain. But I think the pendulum swings for a reason, and each approach does have its place. And Werner, again, AWS CTO, he has a pretty great quote. I think that he tweeted, I don't know if it's a title, but he certainly tweeted, evolvable software systems are a strategy and not a religion. So don't be dogmatic about what you build, right? Be able to be flexible to change. But essentially, if you've got the CTO of Amazon saying, hey, not everything needs to be serverless, probably worth listening to. So what should you do in terms of actual practical things? If you're small, say fewer than 20 or 30 engineers, just think carefully before adopting microservices at all. But the operational benefit likely doesn't offset the complexity. A well-designed monolith with clear internal boundaries will probably serve you better to start until you get up to the multiple team size. As you get to multiple teams, you probably want to introduce services for truly independent components. Typically we see auth as the first thing people do, those kinds of things. But be strategic, right? You want to really think about what you want to split out from the main code base. These early services often become the most important and longest lasting parts of your architecture as well. I can't tell you how often I've been called into a customer that says, hey, we've had this thing in a corner for 6 years, no one's looked at it, now it doesn't integrate with all the rest of our stuff because we haven't maintained it. So what you take out first, don't forget about, right? Build it with intent, still maintain it. When you start scaling a lot larger, you probably want to consider domain-oriented approaches, right? Identify clusters of services that logically belong together, introduce gateways to simplify the dependencies, and everyone, you probably want to ask yourself this at least yearly, what is getting deployed together? Can we consolidate? Is your distributed monolith itself just giving you complexity without the benefits? Are you paying a premium for Lambda functions that run continuously? This, again, I get called in a lot. If you're running Lambda all the time, it is more expensive. There's a 3-letter mining company that I consulted for a while ago. I won't name names, but they were paying I think in hundreds of thousands of dollars for Lambda, where an ECS task was literally, I think, 1% in terms of rate. So again, don't run things constantly with Lambda, know the architecture. Could you simplify your architecture by grouping related services behind a gateway? It's another really common and good pattern. I've got to wrap up because I'm getting flashed by the timer, but I think the utopia kind of doesn't exist, right? We live in a world now where the pendulum swung one way, it's swung the other. We've seen centralized to decentralized, we've seen compiled to interpreted, we've seen on-prem to cloud, maybe going back to on-prem a bit, but now we're seeing the pendulum swing away from distribution towards consolidation a little bit. But I think with each swing, we learn something new, and it's really important to take the best ideas from each world and carry them forward. The monoliths of today aren't your sort of dad's monoliths. They're certainly more reliable, they're more stable, and they're easier to deploy. But just build software with an open mind. That's it. I'll wrap up because the time is up. Please feel free to give me feedback. On the left is my LinkedIn, on the right is the feedback. So if you want to add me, have any questions, please go for it. But thank you, otherwise.